Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to see you. Actually, to be accurate, I must say I can't see you, but I feel your presence in some very real way. A couple of upcoming programmatic notes that I hope you'll find of interest. This Saturday with Rabbi Yoshi Zweiback, you'll have a very wonderful light evening discussing the movie Young Frankenstein. That's this Saturday night. And then on January 11th, our next larger lecture will be a dialogue with Lael Leibovitz and myself. He's an extraordinarily interesting man, an original thinker. I hope that you will join us for both of those evenings, and I look forward to seeing you. And now to the program at hand. It's my pleasure to introduce Deborah Tannen. She is university professor and professor of linguistics at Georgetown University. She writes about language and how our use of language impacts relationships. She authored You Just Don't Understand, Women and Men in Conversation, which was a New York Times bestseller for 4 years and #1 on the bestseller list for 8 months. The book has been translated into 31 languages. That is quite an accomplishment. She has been interviewed on many familiar television shows, among them 2020, Good Morning America, The Today Show, The Rachel Ray Talk Show, PBS NewsHour, Charlie Rose, Oprah, and you've likely read her words in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Atlantic, HuffPost, Newsweek, Time, USA Today, People, and the Harvard Business Review. She holds the rare rank of distinguished professor at Georgetown and has been a lecturer at Princeton. The topic of her speech this evening is that of the title of her most recently published book, Finding My Father. It is her 13th book, I believe. We had a little preliminary discussion before we went on, so she may have written even more. I don't remember exactly, but I think 13. And during her talk, by the way, we invite you to submit questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. May I suggest that you don't wait to the end of her presentation, but send questions as they occur to you. Professor Tannen, we are delighted that you have set aside time to be with us at Stephen Wise Temple. And my friends, it is with pleasure that I ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Deborah Tannen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this talk tonight. I, like the rabbi, I'm sorry I can't see you, but I'm happy to know that you're out there. Of course, it's 10 o'clock at night for me here in Washington, D.C., but I think adrenaline's gonna have me wide awake for this. As you just heard, this book is completely different from any other book that I have written. And it took me so much longer to write. In a way, I sometimes say that it took me longer than all the other books put together to write this one. I started thinking about writing it in the 80s, and I began seriously working on it in the mid-90s. And then for various reasons, it was the back shelf, the front shelf, and finally coming out now, which is so satisfying to me because the book is so personal, so different from all the others that I've written. There are really 3 important aspects of it, maybe themes, if you want to say, in a way. One is the personal. I adored my father. He was the parent that I felt an affinity with, the one that I thought understood me. But when I was a kid growing up, he was never home. The strongest presence that I felt in the house was his absence. And so in a way, writing this book and the time that I spent with him, talking about his life and reading the mountains of words, by the way, that he left me. My father was a writer not by vocation, but by talent and by, I think, his nature. And so he left notes and memories, gave me journals that he had written, that he wrote before he married, and letters. He kept copies, I think, of every letter that he ever received, and copies of many of letters that he wrote. So going through all these words and the hours that I spent talking to him made that connection possible that I had so longed for as a child. I have 200 cassette tapes of conversations with my father that I taped. And when I was talking to him after he retired at 70, he had the time finally and loved talking about his past. And so I would put on headphones and take notes when I talked to him on the phone, and have my laptop out, take notes when I talked to him in person. And I have, as I said, 200 cassette tapes. So there was that personal element of it, the connection with my father that I created in writing the book. But there is also the historical reason for writing it. My father lived to be 98. He was born in 1908 in Warsaw into a Hasidic family. Came to the United States in 1920 when he was 12 and lived to be 98. His life spanned the 20th century and all the cataclysmic events of that century. World War I, that massive immigration of Eastern European Jews to the United States, at which he came to the tail end. The Depression, all these events so shaped his life, and his life reflects the effects of all these events, especially from a Jewish perspective. So this historical significance was also something that was important to me in writing the book. And then there's another element to it, and I doubt I'll have time to talk about it much today, but it is much in the book, and you can ask me in the question period if you like, which I'm looking forward to. There was a woman that my father might have married instead of my mother. She was not a secret. Both my parents talked about her, referred to her as my mother's rival. And my father said at one time when I was talking to him, in one of those tapes that I referred to, your mother wasn't my girlfriend. Helen was my girlfriend. So why did he marry Helen and not my mother? There was once that he made a reference to the fact that he had kept her letters. He said, I don't know where they are, but if I could find them, I would give them to you. He knew that I was writing this book, approved of my writing the book, and was giving me all these materials for it. I did find those letters. He did give them to me. And there's a chapter of the book about how reading those letters did give me an insight. And I should say, not only this, I found where he had kept all those letters hidden, he also had kept copies of many of his letters to her. So I was able to read that entire exchange. So that's another whole story, which maybe I'll be able to say something about later. But what I would really like to focus on today in my comments is the historical, and especially from the Jewish perspective. What it was about my father's life that I learned writing this book that gave me more insight into that century and into the way that it shaped my father's life, and really indirectly my own as well. The fact that my father was born into this Hasidic family in Warsaw, the block they lived on was in the center of Hasidic Warsaw. At that time, the Jewish population of Warsaw was about a third of the population of the city, and 2/3 of the Jews were Hasidim. My father did not grow up in his nuclear family, but in his mother's nuclear family. His father had died of tuberculosis when my father was very small. He never knew his father. And so he and his mother and a sister who was just a year and a half older shared a single room in the household of his mother's parents, his grandmother and his grandfather, devout Hasidim. and his mother's many brothers and sisters. There were many. There are 13 whose stories I know and can tell, and I write about them in the book. But there were 9 who were living there at the time that my father was there. And he was really the youngest, like the youngest child in that household. And his memories of that household were very warm. During World War I, they were cold, they were hungry. There was never enough of anything. And yet his memories in many ways were very positive because of what he referred to as the warmth, the liveliness of this household with so many aunts and uncles. When he came to the United States in 1920, and this is kind of interesting, his mother was had established and was the principal of a school. It was the first school for Hasidic girls that existed in Poland and probably in Warsaw and probably in all of Poland. She had been asked she had been hired to start this school by a German rabbi and officer in the German army who came to Poland with the army in World War I. Many of my father's memories are very detailed, and the memories of the German soldiers in World War I are very different from the behavior of the German soldiers in World War II. But my father's memories of that time of his childhood in Warsaw were so detailed, so vivid to him, that I actually started out thinking, my thought about the book in the beginning was that I was going to recreate that Jewish community of Warsaw that the Nazis had destroyed in World War II. But in reading about the period, I realized, and this was in the words of a Polish historian who wrote about this, it was actually World War I that was the twilight of Jewish Warsaw. When my father came to this country at 12 in 1920, he told me he was already an atheist, a communist, and a Zionist. How could he at 12 already be an atheist and a communist? And I asked him at one point, and these were different conversations, but at one point, when did you become a communist? And another, when did you become an atheist? He answered them both the same way. His mother's youngest sister was only 6 years older than my father, so she was more like an older sister, and he adored her, and he looked up to her, as many of us do, as I did with my oldest sister. And he said, I followed her around. Her name was Magda, and she was a communist. As a teenager, she was swept up in the Bolshevik Revolution. This is one of the many ways that my father's life was shaped by these events of Eastern Europe at that time. Like so many young people, like young people today, they looked around, they saw poverty, they saw injustice, they saw hatred among people that made no sense to them. And communism was going to transform all that. Of course, it was just the beginning of communism. Nobody knew yet what it was going to turn into. And so my father said that because his aunt Magda would get together with her friends and they would talk about their belief and their hope of how communism was going to bring about a better world, and there would be no animosity between groups. There would be no anti-Semitism because workers of the world would unite. And so that was already the influence on him when he came to this country. So he came at 12. At 14, he quit high school and went to work full-time in New York's garment district. And that was because he had no father. So his mother, who had been principal of a school, she had set up the school and run it for the years between, it was the middle of World War I that she was hired to do this, and then 1920 when she left, was never able to find work in this country that she could support her family. Excuse me. My father said that she tried. She got a job at a bank, But as soon as she took Saturday off, she lost that job. She tried sewing. She was good at it, but she was too slow. And so my father felt that he had to quit high school and go to work full time. But he was determined that he was going to get a profession. He managed to take high school equivalency tests one by one, get into law school. You didn't have to go to college to go to law school at that time. Got a law degree, got a master's degree in law, passed the bar, and it was the Depression. So it was not possible to get a job as a lawyer. He kept, that was his goal, that he was going to practice law as soon as he passed the bar. He was 19 when he first finished law school, and he was 50 before he was able finally to make a living as a lawyer. And that was, in a way, the drama of his life from his perspective. When he retired at 70, he sat down to write his memories of his life. And what he did was write down all the jobs that he had held. And it came to 68. 68 different jobs that he had held from the time he came to this country until he set up his own law firm. It was a workman's compensation law firm in New York City. He looked at these 68 jobs, and by the way, after he made the list of the jobs, he set about describing everyone, in many cases dictating them onto tape recordings for me, and in other cases writing it. And again, his memories were uncanny, just as he had so many detailed memories of his childhood in Warsaw, what things looked like, what the neighborhood looked like, people that he knew, incidents. He had similar detailed memories for every one of these 68 jobs. And there were things like his first job when he first came here, didn't speak English, but he was delivering telegrams. And then he was delivering a Yiddish newspaper. In fact, he would go to the synagogue on Saturday, and his mother and sister went to the women's part, so he went to the men's part, and then he would sneak out, deliver newspapers, and get back in time to meet his mother and sister, as if he had been at the service the entire time. He looked at these 68 jobs with a combination of pride and regret. Pride because he had done whatever he had to do to support his family, and regret because it had taken him so long to actually practice the profession that he sacrificed so much. And this is the kind of thing that reading his journals and talking to him at length, especially reading these early journals, helped me understand things that I knew, but I didn't really know what they meant. I had said so many times, as I said tonight to you, he went to law school at night. What did that mean? From reading the journal, I came to understand he worked 10 hours in the factory. He would finish, he had no time to eat dinner after he finished. He would go immediately to law school. He would get home at 10:30 at night and only then eat dinner. Then he would have to study his law books for several hours, sleep only a few hours, get up the next morning and start again. Half hour for lunch, that was it. Otherwise, it was working 10-hour days in the factory. So that level of sacrifice, but for him, it was an investment. He was going to be a lawyer. When he looked back at these jobs, it was a feeling of pride that he had done what he needed to do, but also regret that it took him so long. And this is one thing that really did affect me and my sisters. I have two sisters, and I have, throughout writing this, I was constantly talking to my sisters and checking their memories with mine, and they have the same memory of this as I do. A sense of regret was like a shadow over the family because of my father's combination of bad luck and in some cases bad decisions. And I'm going to tell you about only one because it was the one that was the source of the greatest regret and the greatest shadow from that perspective. And because two aspects of his life as an immigrant and his life as a Jew, I think, are represented in this. There was one word that the family would refer to that instantiated this story, and it was the name of a city in Connecticut, Danbury. In 1941, so the Depression was still on, but things were beginning to open up because we were in the war. My father had taken innumerable civil service tests, and the way he put it was there might be 1,000 people taking a test and a handful of jobs. So some civil service tests he had taken led to his being offered a position as a prison guard in the federal penitentiary in Danbury, Connecticut. He did not apply to be a prison guard. He never thought he would be a prison guard, but that was the job he was offered. And he took it. The family moved to Danbury, Connecticut, and the family at that point was my mother, my father, my mother's mother who lived with them, and my oldest sister, who was about 5 at the time. It turned out everybody was very happy in Danbury. My father liked the work. He was quickly promoted to parole officer. The family was happy there. For the first time, they lived in a house, not in a small apartment in the city. And they had a circle of friends, other New York Jews who had gotten the job the same way they did. And they spoke so affectionately of the friends they had made, and some of them were still friends when I knew them later, and I knew them as well. But the life they described with the lifestyle, the friends, the job, and it was all very something that it was the happiest years in many ways of their lives. I know it's very ironic to be happy when you're working in a prison, but it was a minimum security federal penitentiary. It was brand new. It was where all the conscientious objectors were, by the way. Robert Lowell, the poet, was a prisoner there at the time that my father was. But then after about 4 years there, he got a offer based on another civil service exam he had taken to be a alcohol tax inspector, chasing bootleggers. By the way, one of the descriptions of that job from the list of the descriptions of all those jobs that my father kept was from that job, he said, "I gripped the gun hard and waited." What? My father gripping a gun? He was a gentle giant. I never heard him raise his voice. He was really the most gentle person I ever knew. Gripping a gun, he was chasing bootleggers. He had been making $50 a week as parole officer. That was 6 days a week. On the 7th day, he was moonlighting to support the family, driving a taxi, selling things door to door. And so the offer of the job as alcohol tax inspector was going to pay $12 a week more. That's a 25% raise. And so he felt that he had to take it. The question of whether he liked the work, whether he would like that work, whether he would like living in Providence where the new job was, whether the family would be happy there, none of that entered into it. And that was one of many things that made me realize something I hadn't really thought about. Throughout his life, when my father had a decision to make, the only thing he ever asked was, what do I have to do? When I have a decision to make, I ask, what do I want to do? What a privilege and what a difference. He decided to take the job. He goes to the warden, he tells the warden he's been offered this job, he's going to take it. And the warden is beside himself. He says, don't do that. You are doing so well in this job, you are going to be a warden. You're going to be a warden in a year. And he said, that's not possible. A Jew will never be a warden. There is no single Jewish warden in the entire federal penitentiary system. And the warden said, that's because there have been no Jews in the system. But now that there are, it will not be an impediment. I am going to recommend you to be a warden. My father believed that the warden would recommend him, but he did not believe that the higher ups would permit it. And he took the job. The family moved to Providence. Nobody was happy there. The job was fine. My father did well with the job. They did not make friends. They didn't know any of the Jews there. My mother became pregnant with me. She didn't want to have the baby in Providence where she knew no one. Her family, she also had many brothers and sisters who were all in New York City. And so they went back to New York. And my father, again, was unemployed. He took a job as a cutter in the garment district. It was a stopgap measure. He became active in politics. He had, in the meantime, quit the Communist Party in 1939 when Hitler made a pact with, when Stalin made a pact with Hitler. But he had become active in New York's Liberal Party, which held the balance of power between the Republicans and the Democrats. And so they had influence on the Democrats. He actually ran for Congress on the Liberal Party ticket. And he was promised that he would be made a judge as a political appointment. And that's why he took this job in the factory. He was promised he would be a judge the next year, and then the next year, and then wait for the next election. And then after the next election, it was 13 years. He worked in the factory for 13 years. And it was the first 13 years of my life. 1 year into that, when they went back to visit their friends in Danbury, the person who had been given his job as parole officer 1 year later was made warden. And so my father realized that those 13 years that he worked in the factory, he could have had that professional position as a warden. And of course, as warden, his friend was making way more money, but I think what was more important to him was the respect that he had in the community. My father always had a strong, and I had no idea of this, but in talking to him later and reading his memories later, he felt that people looking at him felt that he just wasn't up to being a lawyer. Why was he, with his law degree, working in a factory? I had no sense when I was growing up that he hated the work in the factory. He talked of it with great affection. He talked of his friends and the other workers with great affection. I took that to mean affection for the job. But when he was in the, talking about it later, I asked, how did you feel about it, your work in the factory? And he said, I hated every minute of it. And he hated every minute of all the menial, that is, non-professional work that he did, because he wasn't using his mind. I said that the Danbury job had held to me a secret to both his Jewishness and his immigrant status. As I looked back and again, talking to him and reading what he had written, realized the reason they were so happy in Danbury was the sense of being part of a community that he had had in Warsaw as being part of that Hasidic community. Even though he had given up the religion, his sense of connection to that community was very much a part of him. When he came to this country, his family was reduced to three, a very unhappy three. His mother, who became really depressed in this country, again, something I didn't understand until I read his journals. She was spending her days lying on the couch. He describes her as wearing the same dirty house dress day after day, her hair uncombed. He was a good writer. He describes her stockings falling down, one all the way down, the other halfway down. She was in the depths of depression. And why not? She had the equivalent of a college education. She had been the principal of a school. And now she's being supported by her teenage son. No wonder she became depressed in this country. And that is a view that I got both of the effect on my father of leaving that community and being an immigrant here, and also on his mother and his mother's sisters. His mother's sisters were very accomplished. Again, not time to talk about all this here. You could ask me more in the question period if you like, but one of her sisters was a dentist, another was called a linguist. She spoke many languages. And one was a mathematician and physicist who studied with Einstein in Zurich. Apparently had a love affair with Einstein, and that affair was rekindled in this country. She was in Princeton with him, apparently became pregnant by him, and had an abortion and thought that he would marry her after his wife died, but he did not. So I have lots in the book about how I was able to corroborate many of the aspects of that story, not the part about the abortion. But she too was never able to practice her profession in this country. There was actually a handwritten letter of recommendation for her, handwritten by Einstein. I've known her for many years. She's a very talented physicist, but she never was able to get a job in this country. The second thing about the Danbury job that is, I think, so revealing is this picture of anti-Semitism. I said that my father was a communist. I have his FBI file. I have a copy of his FBI file. How did the FBI happen to have a file on him, and how do I happen to have it? A friend of mine told me she had found her father's FBI file. Her father at that time had deceased. And I said to my father, do you think the FBI might have a file on you? And he said, I know they do. He had no interest in getting it, but he humored me and requested it. And by the way, I'll show you here. This is what a page of his FBI file looks like, if you can see it, all blacked out. But there was one part of it that was not blacked out. And that was, he was called in by the FBI on 2 occasions, and they questioned him. And there is a transcript of those interviews. He was denounced as a communist by a fellow guard at the prison in Danbury. And he tells the FBI agent who is questioning him, he said, I don't know why anybody would think I'm a communist. And by the way, by then he wasn't. He said, but there was a lot of anti-Semitism among the guards and a lot of resentment that I got promoted and I was a Jew. My image of Danbury was this nirvana, this Garden of Eden that my parents had lived in with their Jewish friends. I had no idea that they were a small minority and that they were surrounded by these other many of them anti-Semitic guards. And so that gave so much more credence, explanation to me of the assumption that my father had made that he would not be allowed to be a warden because of as a Jew. And it helped me understand comments that my father made throughout his life. He would just assumed anti-Semitism. He, if you're looking for a parking spot and somebody took it, he would say, oh, he's anti-Semitic. And he would say it, as a good human. By the way, my father was very funny. He always had jokes and wry comments to make. And so that was often an assumption. When I graduated from college, my first job was with Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. And when I announced it at dinner, he said, oh, isn't that nice? In my time, Metropolitan Life Insurance Company didn't hire Jews. I was invited to be commencement speaker at a college in upstate New York. And I was reading my parents' commencement address I had prepared. And in it, I mentioned being Jewish. It's very relevant to my research. My doctoral dissertation was on New York Jewish conversational style. And my father said, after I read it, he said, maybe you shouldn't mention being Jewish. That could turn some people against you. I didn't believe that that was true. I didn't think it could turn anyone against me. I think I was naive. Now I have no question that it probably did. I still would have included it. I wouldn't have taken it out, but I think I was naive about that perspective. I want to leave time for questions, so let me start to wrap up here. There's this memory that my father often told when he was leaving Poland. He was 11 years old. His grandfather, who was the closest he ever had to a father, took him on his lap. And he put his arm around my father's shoulder, and my father recalled seeing the tears that were running from under his gold-rimmed glasses, down his cheeks, into his long white beard. He knew he would never see him again. And with his arm around my father's shoulder, he said, "Never forget that you are a Jew." My father explained that his grandfather believed that when Jews came to America, they ceased being Jews because they ceased being Hasidic. And my father repeated that. He said, those are my grandfather's last words to me. Never forget that you are a Jew. Once when he was old, he said, sometimes I wondered, did I betray him? And I'm sure he did not. In writing the book, thought to myself, you remember you're a Jew by remembering him and his memories of Warsaw. Warsaw had many memories of his grandfather. And I remember I'm a Jew by remembering my father. But it isn't only that. I asked my father, because he spoke so much of Poland, clearly had his image of himself was as an immigrant. Clearly, he frequently said things to me like, you and I are sensitive, not like Americans who are cold. By the way, people often think that about Americans because they don't express emotions the way their people with the country they came from did. But my father, he actually wrote a letter to the aunt Magda, the aunt he loved so much. He was 25 years old, he was married, he was a lawyer, and yet he wrote to her, I have always felt myself part of that life, the life of Warsaw that I lived with you and not of the life I've lived since I came here. And I think in many ways he always felt that way. So I asked him when he was quite old, he's I think probably 97, I said, Daddy, do you feel more American or more Polish? And he said, I feel like a Jew. And I believe that although he gave up Hasidism, he kept the stance toward life, the perspective on life of Hasidism. He actually made fun of the fact that his grandfather and the others he grew up with, say a prayer about everything. You say a prayer when you wash your hands. You say a prayer when you go to the toilet. And yet my father in this country would say, aren't we lucky? We have clean water. We have a warm house to live in. We have plenty of food. We have flush toilets. By the way, they had indoor plumbing in Warsaw too. But that's what saying prayers is about. It's about a stance of gratitude. And my father had that. I think his communism was tikkun olam, to repair the world. His love of language, of reading, of writing, that is very Jewish. It's Hasidic. It was from my father that I learned always to have a dictionary at hand, so that if there was ever a word I didn't quite know the meaning of, wasn't sure of the pronunciation, you go over to the dictionary and check it. Of course, now the dictionary is in my phone, like everything else. And of course, that's a convenience. But when I walked across the room to the dictionary, I always felt my father was walking with me. And when I look the word up in the dictionary, I'm on my own. One of many ways that I miss my father. But writing the book really, in a way, changed that, or somewhat changed that. When he was very old, again, maybe about 97, we were talking about how long he had lived. He would say, how old am I, 97? That's ridiculous. What's a 97-year-old man doing walking around? So we were talking about how long he had lived, how long I might live, how I would like living that long. And I said, I don't know. I guess I won't know till it happens. And he said, well, I'll have to talk to you from upstairs. I'll be watching over you from up there. It's now 14 years since he died. And yet I feel that by leaving me so many of his words, his memories, he has been talking to me from upstairs. And I feel like that by having written this book, I have managed to keep him with me, to keep talking to him, to keep the conversation going. And I'm going to show you his picture from the front of the book. I don't know how much you can see there, but I do feel that I have managed to keep him with me by keeping him in this book. So thank you so much. And I very much look forward to hearing your questions.
Wow. Well, first, thank you, Deborah, Dr. Tannen. I have to say, first of all, what page is the thing about Einstein and that woman? I mean, I want to go straight to that. I didn't expect that. I haven't read the book yet. And then the love letters about your, you didn't describe them as love letters, but the letters of your father to Helen, that's good stuff.
Some are love letters, not all, some are.
Okay. So I'm very curious. You described your father as a atheist, communist, and Zionist. He was self-described at 12, though he dropped the communism, and his own relationship to Judaism. One of the questions to be asked of you is, what is your relationship to Judaism these days? And how did that impact you?
Yes, thank you. And I have a chapter that I talk about that. My father, I feel like my father, when he said, I feel like a Jew, the comment I make after that is, for him, his nationality was not his fundamental identity. For me, being a female, being a woman, being American, and being a Jew are three absolutely fundamental aspects of my identity, immutable, defining. I feel like, and it's ironic because, and sometimes I feel guilty talking to observant Jews. By the way, I grew up thinking you could be secular or observant, and I think now the terms are cultural and religious. But because we were secular Jews, it didn't in any way mean you're less of a Jew. You were just a different, you were acting it out in a different way. Everything about my upbringing was Jewish. My father's sense of humor, Yiddish. My English is still so speckled with Yiddish that I frequently am using Yiddish words, and then I see a blank look and I realize, oh yeah, I have to define it.
So again, your father, with 68 different jobs, took him a while to land where he ultimately landed. What about you? Did you have a circuitous route to becoming a professor of linguistics? Was that something you had decided early on, or were there did you have a number of different incantations in your own professional life?
Great question.
That one was mine, actually, but thank you.
No way. I was 30 when I started grad school in linguistics. And this is another fascinating thing. Talking to my father, I actually talk about this in the book. He was telling me that he, and this is relevant to the story about Helen, he felt he could not marry because he had to support his mother and sister, so he couldn't afford to get married. But he also didn't want to get married because he wanted to be free to travel the world, to learn languages. And so he felt his dream was wait till his mother and sister marry, there'll be some other man's responsibility, and he'll be free to travel and learn languages and learn the ways of different countries, live in different countries. That's what I wanted to do. I didn't know he wanted to do that, but that's what I wanted to do. And lucky me, I came of age in the 60s when there were limitless possibilities. So yeah, after college, I worked long enough to save up some money, went to Europe on a one-way ticket. My goal was to go around the world, overland, and end up in Japan and teach English. I only got as far as Greece. but I did teach English in Greece and lived there for several years. But then I came back and got a master's in English, was teaching remedial writing and freshman composition for a number of years at Lehman College in the Bronx. And then I was bored and I wanted to do something different, and I decided to get a PhD in linguistics.
You've been a professor a long time. Just as a follow-up to that question, have students changed in your years as a professor? And if so, in what way?
That's such a good question. This is my 41st year teaching at Georgetown. I can't say that I've noticed a great change in the students. I don't see them as cynical the way, you hear people say that millennials. I have always found the Georgetown students to be idealistic. Georgetown has a motto, women and men for others. It's a Jesuit school. I grew up in a Catholic neighborhood in Brooklyn, so I'm comfortable with that. And they, whether they do go on and do all the good in the world that they want to, I don't know, but they certainly are idealistic.
Someone asked that wanted to ask you about your mother, since you had written the very detailed biography about your dad. Can you speak a little bit about your mom?
Yes, thank you for asking. My mother was born in Russia, actually Belarus. She was born in Minsk, also an immigrant. Also came to this country at about 11. My mother's immigrant story is even more dramatic than my father's. It was not, you couldn't legally leave Russia. So her father and several siblings came first, saved money, sent money back. The first people they had to pay, it's kind of like what coyotes taking people across the border from Mexico. They had to pay a smuggler to take them through the woods in a horse-drawn carriage into Poland, where they could legally come to this country. And it was the first person they paid stole the money.
Wow.
The father had to send more. Then it was 1920. This is very dramatic about my father's years after my parents came. I always knew it was unusual that my parents were born in Europe. That too makes me feel much more directly connected to that Eastern European Jewish community. I didn't particularly know why that was the case, but the reason is my father came in 1920. That was the last year there were no limits on immigration from Eastern Europe. 21 were the first limits, quotas, and 24, the quotas were so high that the door slammed shut. So my mother tried to come in 21, and these quotas had been instituted. So they had to hide out in Poland for 2 years. She caught tuberculosis there.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's a much more dramatic story. But my mother had no interest in talking about her past. I would ask her, and she'd say, "Oh, no, nothing, it was a normal life. Do you remember anything about your friends?" "Now we had friends, we played." And whereas my father, she would tell me the names and the games they played and how they met them and what, so she just wasn't interested in talking about the past. So I couldn't write about her past.
I know that many of us, as we get older, we see a lot of our parents in ourselves, and we begin to realize it more and more as we get older. But when you write such a detailed biography and uncover so many layers, I'm curious, was there anything about your father that taught you about you that surprised you?
Whether it surprised me about me, I'm not so sure.
Did you learn anything about yourself?
Him.
I guess they rephrase it. Did you learn anything about yourself as you began to really uncover the layers of your father's life?
I was struck, as I said, how so many of the things that I thought I had come up with all on my own, like this passion for learning languages and this wanting to just, go around the world and live in different places and learn the customs. I must have picked it up from him. And certainly, of course, the love of language, which I knew I had gotten from him. I didn't realize how unhappy my father was, because he always never let it be known that he was unhappy. And I have kind of a tendency to get depressed. I think that's not that unusual for writers. And I had always traced it to my mother. I had no idea that it may have certain roots in my father's past too.
Well, let me just first of all tell everybody who is viewing, I hope that this whets your appetite and that you'll pick up the book, Finding My Father, because it obviously not only going to be beautifully written, but you had mentioned it in some way by doing this. You know, you brought him to life to you, but in your speaking about him to all of us, you made him alive to all of us as well. And what a beautiful, beautiful tribute. I want to thank you, Dr. Tannen, for staying up late, for sharing so much of your life with us, and for taking the time to share, you know, personal stories of your upbringing and of so much. Thank you so much, and to all of you who have viewed the evening, thank you for being here. We'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you.